Good evening, and welcome back to Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, the host and narrator of Dead Sleep, and before we dive into tonight's story, can we all just take a deep breath? Maybe it's a sigh of relief that we've finally found each other. I'm not kidding. I thought I was the only one who listened to true crime before bed. And I figured I'd create the kind of true crime show I always wanted. And maybe there were a few people out there like me who also fell asleep to true crime and just wanted something they could listen to and feel okay about. Good stories, not too loud, not too long, and not filled with 911 calls and obnoxious ads. I'm really so thrilled and tickled by the response to the show. Thank you so much for your support. So with that, let's close our eyes and get ready to fall dead asleep with Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I thought for tonight's story, it would be fun to share a piece that I worked on. A true crime story that is wild and complicated and a little personal. So I'm just gonna tell it like how it happened. Way back in 2004, when I was a youngish reporter, I moved from New York to LA to work as a reporter for Entertainment Weekly. I was under a lot of stress. New job, new city, and when I'm stressed, it comes out in two ways. Insomnia, of course, and on my skin. So I saved my reporter pennies, and I went to see the West Hollywood skin guru to the stars. Her name was Dawn DeLuise. That's Dawn, D-A-W-N, DeLuise. Not to be confused with Dom DeLuise of Cannonball Run fame. Though, come to think of it, he had nice skin too. This was the mid-2000s in LA. Paris Hilton and Lindsay Lohan ran the streets. The coffee bean and tea leaf was the equivalent of Erewhon. And Dawn, she looked the part of the mid-2000s celebrity facialist. She was a white woman in her 40s with this caramel glaze of a spray tan. She had this mane of beachy blonde hair and wore a matching pink sweatsuit, hoodie on top, and the bottom might have said juicy on the butt. She reminded me of a cross between Farrah Fawcett and Amy Poehler as the cool mom in Mean Girls. Dawn was cheery and upbeat with this chirpy sing-song voice. Her spa space was small and intimate, just one table, in a room that was lit by candles that smelled like vanilla and almonds. And before we get into the bad thing that Dawn did, let me tell you about the good thing. Dawn's facials. Her facials were that perfect combination of steamy and creamy with relaxing massage. It was so relaxing. And she had this little device that zapped my skin and it worked. Over time, my skin got better, in part thanks to Dawn's treatments. The years went by and I'd see Dawn every so often, and she was always smiling, always happy, always looking on the bright side. I never saw Dawn's dark side. Then one day in 2014, I was sitting at my desk. I wasn't a reporter anymore. I was now an editor at Los Angeles Magazine. LA Mag was known for its true crime stories. In fact, a lot of the big cases you know about, from Mitrice Richardson to the Zankou chicken murders to the Golden State Killer, those started as Los Angeles Magazine stories. So this incredible writer, his name's Greg Nichols, sent me an email with a link. His email said something like, "Now this is a story." The article was a British tabloid that had picked up a story about a woman, a facialist in Hollywood, a skincare diva to the stars, who'd been arrested. There was a picture of the facialist, a mugshot. It was Dawn DeLuise. The woman in the mugshot looked disheveled and grim. She had dark under-eye circles, and her hair was a nest like she'd just woken up. It did not do the facialist I knew any justice. But that wasn't the kind of justice authorities were looking for. The chipper esthetician in the matching juicy sweatsuit was accused of trying to kill someone. A murder-for-hire plot, apparently, that had gone awry. I noticed that Dawn's bail was $1 million. A bail of $1 million strongly suggests prosecutorial confidence. That this is a big case and it's a good case. You're in jail and they're going to keep you there. So the writer, Greg, and I wrote to Dawn in jail, and I asked her if she wanted to speak with us. I wanted to find out what happened. And Dawn wrote back and said yes. She was desperate to talk to someone. She was innocent. She couldn't believe it was happening to her, but it was. Greg, the writer, and I didn't know what to believe. Was Dawn really who I thought she was? Was she capable of trying to kill someone? Who did she want to kill? And why? So tonight's Dead Sleep episode is drawn from a story I edited that was written by Greg Nichols, an article that appeared in the magazine in 2015. It's a great piece that I recommend you reading, so I'm going to share a link in the show notes. This is Behind the Mask. The slashed tires were child's play, a ramp-up, a prelude to the big show. It was January 2014. Dawn DeLuise, a 55-year-old esthetician with a small but successful facial and waxing studio in West Hollywood, began receiving phone calls. She didn't recognize the incoming numbers. When she answered, strange men told her they wanted to do things to her. She traced the calls to several raunchy posts in the men-seeking women section of Craigslist, advertisements she had not created. One of the posts read, "Mature woman, celebrity facialist, wants no strings attached sex." A few times, men showed up with a certain expectation. Dawn remembers that she would sit in the dark, praying they would go away. "I just held my breath," she said. The flyers came next, blowing across Santa Monica Boulevard and littering the sidewalk in front of the building where her salon was located. The photoshopped images were grotesque. Dawn's bleach blonde feathery hair and beaming face atop a comically large-breasted woman in the throes of intercourse with an anonymous man. "First time free," one flyer read. "Sex party tonight," another advertised, in the bold sans serif similar to the typeface used in notices for lost dogs. Emails with the same disturbing photos went to DeLuise's clients, her neighbors, even the pastor of her congregation. The church secretary offered to pray for her. But she was beyond prayers now. This was a police matter. Dawn lived near the North Hollywood police station and spoke with officers there on 5 separate occasions. She got the same answer each time. "We have a big caseload. Stalking crimes are very hard to prove." Dawn pleaded with the police. She told them she knew who was doing it. A rival esthetician had recently moved a couple of doors down from her clinic, she explained. His name, she said, was Gabriel Suarez. They'd had trouble since the very beginning, and since then things had only escalated. This Gabriel had been harassing her for weeks, months. She was sure he was behind all this. For months, Dawn had endured slashed tires, lewd flyers, and cyber menacing. She'd even gotten used to the catty texts criticizing her fashion choices. "You don't look very good in yellow," one text read, and "You look very tired today." It was when this guy targeted her 2 daughters that she'd officially had it. Her girls were in their 20s, and someone had faked a bunch of lewd photos and sent offensive messages to scores of people pretending to be them. One fateful night in March of 2014, Dawn was done. She was done with the harassment by a man she had to walk past every single day. Gabriel, who pretended he didn't know her and ignored her, then threatened her from afar. In the heat of the moment, Dawn dashed off a text to her friend Eddie. She revealed to Eddie that she'd found someone who was going to take Gabriel out. She told Eddie the hitman's name and mentioned he was an ex-football player. Soon after, in that early March of 2014, a loud knock on the door woke Dawn from her troubled sleep. The North Hollywood police then burst into her apartment. A female officer took Dawn into a bathroom where she waited while officers searched her home. They found Dawn's cell phone plugged into a charger. The lead investigator asked for her password, which Dawn gave him. Then he scrolled through her messages, looking for something. The police located the exchange between Dawn and her friend Eddie, and then placed Dawn under arrest. For what? Dawn demanded. The investigator didn't immediately tell her the charge, but she did learn that it was connected to that text she'd sent to Eddie. Somehow, her text, the one where she said she knew someone who would take Gabriel out, had made it into the hands of the police. Dawn was confused and angry. "But I'm the victim," she protested. Dawn was taken to the West Hollywood Sheriff's Station. She was charged with solicitation to commit murder. She was put in a holding cell. A few days later, she was moved to the airport courthouse, a tall cathedral of glass on La Cienega near LAX. By then, word had spread that a psychofacialist tried to kill her competition. Television cameras flanked the judge's bench, and photographers snapped pictures when she was escorted in. Dawn was handcuffed and wore the gray hoodie she'd thrown on the night she was arrested. Dawn was arraigned and stood accused of attempting to hire a hitman to kill Gabriel Suarez. Her bail was set at $1 million. Her mugshot, revealing an exhausted-looking woman with an unkempt appearance and a grim expression, made tabloid headlines. After the arraignment, Dawn was booked at the Century Regional Detention Facility, a jigsaw puzzle of interlocking concrete buildings abutting the 105 freeway in Linwood. Dawn figured it was a formality. They were going to let me go, she thought. They had to. Then a week passed, and another. As Dawn sat, awaiting a trial date, Dawn wondered how the detective knew about those texts. As those weeks turned into months behind bars, Dawn would tell anyone who would listen, from her ex-husband to her court-appointed lawyer to a handful of reporters, that someone was maliciously plotting against her. But who and how and why? When she tried to explain it all out loud from behind prison glass, it didn't make any sense. She sounded like she'd lost her mind. And maybe she had. The complex that once housed Dawn's business, the skin refinery, looked like a Neapolitan cake. 2 rainbow flags fluttered proudly alongside the stars and stripes in the well-landscaped median out front. Dawn's suite was on the 2nd floor. She had been in West Hollywood since 2000 and amassed a long and growing list of clients who would come in for pricey eyebrow waxes and facials. They formed a loyal base, and she cherished them all. But success in LA's beauty business is measured in celebrities. Dawn had performed treatments on Jennifer Aniston and Ted Danson, among others. For a short time several years ago, she said Hillary Clinton had used products from her line. Dawn was a savvy self-promoter. In 2011, Nicki Minaj had gone berserk after a session with Dawn, screaming that her eyebrows were ruined. In other industries, a business owner would do anything to quash news of a disgruntled client, but Dawn spoke to Ryan Seacrest about the incident. Any association with a star was free publicity. Gabriel Suarez moved into the complex in the late spring of 2013. From that very first day, it was clear that things between these two beauty experts were destined to get ugly. Gabriel was in his early 30s and handsome. He planned to call his clinic Smooth Cheeks and would cater mostly to men. Before the June opening, he'd hired contractors to renovate his suite. The work noise echoed through the courtyard. When Dawn heard the racket from Gabriel's renovations, she was with a client. After the session, she went into full Karen mode. She stomped over and confronted the hired workers, who didn't seem to understand her. When Gabriel arrived a few minutes later and asked if he could help her, Dawn turned and glared and said a rude, racist comment about workers not speaking English. Dawn's business was in West Hollywood, a place that celebrates diversity and inclusion. But Dawn wasn't a native Angelino, and this whole Hollywood beauty business was Dawn's second act. Raised in a strict Christian family, Dawn spent an itinerant childhood following her preacher father up and down the eastern seaboard. The family later settled in Panama City, Florida, a small beach community that Dawn couldn't wait to escape. And escape she did. When she was 17, she married a man whose greatest quality was his desire to leave the Sunshine State. In 1982, when Dawn was 21, the young couple moved to Los Angeles with $600 to their names. The marriage ended a year later. Dawn found an apartment in Hollywood and began working a series of temp jobs and doing some risque modeling for the Fredericks of Hollywood catalog. In 1983, she married Rick DeLuise and went on to earn an accounting degree. It wasn't until she was 34 and pregnant with her second child that she visited a skincare specialist for her first facial. The esthetician was a working mother who made good money and had a flexible schedule. The idea appealed to Dawn, and she enrolled in beauty school. Her cheerleader personality and shrewd business sense helped her navigate a competitive apprenticeship at a high-end salon. She discovered a company that made a machine using a low-level electrical current to promote skin toning. It was an old technology that dated all the way back to the golden age of Hollywood, when studios offered beauty services to their contract movie stars. In 2000, Dawn began advertising galvanic ionization facials for $125 a visit. Clients lined up to have their faces professionally pulsed with electrodes. In May of 2013, just before her grand Karen moment with Gabriel and the construction workers, Dawn had drinks with a famous journalist, a Vanity Fair writer named Nancy Jo Sales. Nancy Jo and Dawn first met years before in connection with a story Nancy Jo was writing. And as often happens with journalists and old sources, they'd remained in touch. Their meeting ran late and intersected with a meeting between Nancy Jo and a young man named Nick Prugo. For true crime followers, Nick Prugo's name might be familiar. He was a key player in the Bling Ring burglaries, a string of high-profile break-ins perpetrated by fame-obsessed kids from Calabasas. Nancy Jo wrote a feature about the teens for Vanity Fair in 2010, which later became a movie directed by Sofia Coppola. After pleading no contest in March of 2012 to charges related to those crimes, Nick spent a year in jail. He'd been out a month when he arrived at the West Hollywood watering hole where Dawn and Nancy Jo were catching up. It was a chance encounter that would forever change the lives of Dawn and Nick. It turned out Dawn and Nick lived near each other in the valley, so Dawn offered to give Nick a ride home. On the drive, the two spoke about Nick's ambition to work in the entertainment industry. Nick was 22, slender, and quick to smile. Dawn found him charming. An idea for a reality show began to form. Drawing on the hype surrounding the new Bling Ring movie, this show would present Nick as a break-in expert. He and Tess Taylor, who was also associated with the Bling Ring, would use their skills to reveal security flaws in upscale homes. They even hatched a name for the show: High-End Heists. Dawn would be Nick's talent manager, which meant Dawn would go from serving the Hollywood elite to becoming an industry player. Dawn had zero experience as a talent manager, but her success in the Hollywood-adjacent world of beauty enabled her to secure a publicist and an agent for Nick. As a favor to Nick, Dawn also contacted Nick's parole officer. Dawn assured him that developing a reality show would fulfill the employment condition of Nick's parole. Dawn made sure Nick went to meetings on time and followed through on his commitments, which was a full-time job in and of itself. Sometimes Dawn had to plead with Nick to get out of bed. Their relationship was half friendship, she gave him free facials, and half business partnership. For her work as his manager, Dawn agreed to receive 20% of Nick's earnings if they ever sold their High-End Heist reality TV series. Nick began bringing an acquaintance around when he visited Dawn's skincare clinic. His name was Eddie Feinstein. Nick and Eddie, they had a special bond. Nick first met Eddie in a special section of LA Men's Central Jail reserved for gay and transgender inmates. They were both non-violent offenders. Eddie, then 29, had been arrested for a parole violation stemming from a prior arrest for grand theft and identity theft. After Eddie's release in midsummer of 2013, he and Nick resumed their friendship on the outside. Dawn became friendly with Eddie by association. Eddie's boyish features, a well-coiffed head of strawberry blonde hair and acne scars on his ruddy cheeks, were just beginning to clash with the first graceless strokes of aging. Eddie began visiting Dawn for facials to help his complexion. Dawn found him arrogant. Every time she saw him, she swore it would be the last. But Nick encouraged the friendship between Dawn and Eddie, and together, the three became a loose trio. Dawn knew about Eddie's original arrest, but the details were vague and it didn't sound particularly menacing. I mean, he couldn't be worse than someone who was in the Bling Ring, right? It was now June 2013. Gabriel had open, smooth cheeks and was doing a brisk business. Dawn had had no interaction with Gabriel since their run-in over the construction noise the month before, but she sensed there was bad blood. One day in July, she was driving her car and noticed her tires were leaking air. She had them replaced, only to discover the new tires she'd just bought were slashed a few days later. Then her tires were slashed again. The woman who managed the auto shop where Dawn took her car for repair told her this was no accident. The tires had been punctured on the sidewall, making them impossible to fix. Whoever was slashing her tires knew exactly what they were doing. Dawn had heard rumors in the close-knit beauty industry that Gabriel wasn't to be trusted. Dawn's gut told her the same. She just got this vibe from him. She just knew he was behind all this. Who else could it be? Dawn shared her misgivings with her new pals, Nick and Eddie, who relished the juicy gossip. One day, Eddie said he spotted Gabriel acting sketchy. He said Gabriel was snooping by the dumpsters. Another time, Eddie said he caught Mr. Smooth Cheeks slyly lurking outside her shop. What Eddie told Dawn validated what she already knew. Gabriel was out to get her. There was also trouble brewing in Dawn's relationship with Nick. Dawn was 30 years older than Nick, and she was tired of feeling like his nagging mother. Nick was unprofessional, entitled, and lazy, and it made Dawn look bad. His behavior also jeopardized their project, high-end heists. Dawn started making Nick pay for facials, which heightened the tension between them. One night at a party in the Hollywood Hills, Dawn and Nick had an argument. Dawn broke off all contact with Nick. She assumed Eddie would side with Nick, but she was wrong. Eddie was also tired of Nick's erratic behavior. Dawn and Eddie formed a little duo, minus Nick. Nick continued to contact Dawn. He left annoying voicemails and sent rude text messages. In response, Dawn took things to a next level. She snitched. She wrote a letter to Nick's parole officer. Their professional relationship was over. She also narked on Nick, revealing he'd violated his parole conditions with a trip to Las Vegas and that he was using drugs. Dawn didn't tell the parole officer her source for that information was Eddie, but it was clear. She and Eddie had turned against Nick. Nick was sent back to jail for violating his parole, and he blamed Dawn entirely for his incarceration. But Dawn had other, more urgent problems. This escalating situation with Mr. Smoothcheeks. It was around this same time that men were appearing at Dawn's home and business asking for the sex they were promised from Craigslist, that a series of X-rated emails were sent to parishioners of her Santa Clarita church. And that's when one member offered to put her in touch with a detective from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Dawn and this detective met at a Denny's in late February of 2014. Over the sizzling sounds of a slam burger and moons over my hammy, Dawn laid out her ordeal from start to finish and told the detective she was sure Gabriel Smoothcheeks was behind the attacks. The detective asked if she'd confronted Gabriel, and she said no, she was too afraid. She said her friend Eddie had seen him acting strangely too. The detective advised her to keep careful records of every instance of harassment. Dawn followed up over the next few days, forwarding the detective texts and emails she received and giving him accounts of lurid phone calls. Dawn also handed over a short list of names, people who had agreed to corroborate her suspicion of Gabriel. Apparently, the investigator thought it most prudent to speak with these witnesses first before reaching out to Gabriel himself. One of those witnesses was Eddie. When the detective interviewed Eddie, he didn't say what the detective thought he was going to say. Eddie confided that the truth was, it was actually Dawn who was behind the harassment herself. He said all this stuff was staged to get rid of her competitor, and she enlisted Eddie to help him make it all look real. Eddie also expressed concern. He revealed that Dawn had gone so off the deep end, she was about to commit murder. As proof, he took out his phone and showed the investigator the text message from Dawn, the one about the football player and how she was going to hire him as her hitman to take Gabriel out. That conversation with Eddie led to the police swarming Dawn's house and arresting her for conspiracy to murder. Much to Dawn's surprise, it was the same detective that she'd met at that Denny's, the cop that she thought was going to work with her to solve her case, who was the very same cop who led her arrest. And when he arrested her, he made a point of saying, "Let me tell you something. Eddie Feinstein is your best friend in the world right now. He saved you from ruining your life." But it didn't feel that way to Dawn. It was December 2014, and Dawn was still in jail, awaiting trial. But Dawn, ever the beauty expert, made a point of keeping up appearances. She wore jailhouse eyeshadow made from a charcoal pencil and toothpaste. She used her commissary lipstick to double as rouge on her cheeks. She kept her fingernails impeccably clean. But all of that was on the outside. On the inside, Dawn was a mess. She'd been lampooned in the press, made to look like a bungling, vicious fool. And her accusations now shifted from Gabriel to this Eddie guy. She didn't know exactly why he did what he did, but she now believed he was behind the stalking, all along. Dawn now realized this Eddie was dangerous, and she swore he stalked women before. But this was now like the Karen who cried wolf. Dawn had zero credibility, and nobody really wanted to hear it. But here's the thing. Dawn was right. Eddie was arrested in 2009 after stealing more than $100,000 from a local pet groomer, which forced the woman into personal bankruptcy. She'd hired Eddie as an assistant, and in no time he gained access to this woman's computer and stole money from her business account. Something similar had happened in San Francisco a year earlier, but due to a backlog of cases, Eddie was never charged. After serving time in prison for ripping off that LA dog groomer, Eddie was released in 2012 and immediately began harassing the same woman again. The woman started receiving hundreds of vile and threatening text messages from spoofed numbers. She also spotted Eddie trolling along the street outside her house. A detective investigated, but tracing all the numbers and tying Eddie to it all was impossible to prove. It was Eddie's roommate, who had grown leery of his creepy behavior, who told police everything she knew. Eddie's cyber harassment of the dog groomer he stole from was enough to bust him for violating the terms of his parole. In a dark twist of fate, this landed him at the Men's Central Jail in Los Angeles, where he met his bling ring best buddy, Nick Prugo. Why would Eddie jeopardize his parole by stalking this same woman? What was his motive in all of this malicious behavior? A detective who tracked Eddie for years described him as pathological. He simply had a compulsion to stalk and harass. And in this detective's opinion, he was never going to stop. For months, Eddie nurtured Dawn's suspicions that she was being stalked and harassed by her skincare rival. She went to work every day, avoiding his salon, unsure of his next moves, and too afraid to confront him. And this fear and helplessness, Dawn said, pushed her to the edge. It was January 2014, 3 months before she was arrested, that Dawn was in Big Bear to get away from it all. Big Bear was a snowy, cozy mountain town. And one night she ran into an acquaintance, an ex-football player who now worked as a personal trainer and owned a company that made barbecue sauce. They had a few drinks, snapped a few selfies, and then Dawn told him about this guy, Gabriel, who was making her life miserable. They joked about different ways they might teach her stalker a lesson, and their brainstorming was dark, hateful, and violent. During the investigation, authorities found a disturbing text message that Dawn sent to that football friend. Dawn mused that Gabriel, who was Mexican and gay, would make an attractive target for a white supremacist. It was evidently this text, and the one to Eddie about hiring that football player to take Gabriel out, that was the crucial evidence they had to arrest Dawn for solicitation to commit murder. But here's the strange thing. It was only after Dawn had been arrested and arraigned that authorities began talking to her friends and neighbors to build that case for prosecution. And it's then, when Dawn was behind bars, that they learned things weren't what they seemed. A neighbor said he saw a man throwing flyers from a moving car. These were the Photoshop flyers that offered free sex, the ones with Dawn's face on them. But when the neighbor gave the description, it didn't match Gabriel. It matched Eddie. Dawn's landlord also confirmed receiving harassing phone calls from a man who claimed Dawn was hosting sex parties at her apartment. And then, and only then, was when detectives decided to look into Eddie's criminal history and discovered the harassment of Dawn fit his MO to a T. However, awareness of this behavior didn't stop authorities from publicly incriminating Dawn. A statement from the sheriff's department made soon after Dawn's arrest said they had solid evidence, not just 2 texts, which showed that Ms. DeLuise was actively involved in planning a murder for hire. 2 senior-level members of law enforcement then appeared on a 2020 segment echoing that same statement to millions of people on TV. In a chilling and ironic twist, it was Eddie himself, the one who Dawn swore was at the bottom of all of this, who appeared as a guest on that 2020 segment. And right there on TV, Eddie said that it was Dawn who had orchestrated this harassment on herself. It took some time, but authorities had to admit that maybe it wasn't entirely the racist facialist with an axe to grind who was behind all of this. Maybe there was more to the story. Maybe this pathological harasser and cybercriminal played a part. In mid-March, authorities obtained a search warrant and confiscated Eddie's computer. Eddie was soon picked up on suspicion of orchestrating the brutal campaign of harassment himself. That was March. And yet, in December, Dawn was still in jail awaiting trial. Why wasn't Dawn free? Because, unfortunately, Dawn had been arrested for solicitation to commit murder, not for stalking. It didn't seem to matter that she'd been manipulated by a pathological harasser. The 2 text messages she'd sent indicated that she wanted to have Gabriel killed. Enough said. The charge carried a maximum of 9 years in prison, but the burden of proof was high. There'd been no exchange of money, which is typically a prerequisite for a conviction, and there didn't seem to be any evidence of a legitimate plot. With all of this media attention, it would have been embarrassing for the DA's office to reverse course and let Dawn go. Prosecutors decided to proceed with the case. Dawn claimed she was offered several deals while in jail and was told that she could walk out the same day if she copped to a lesser felony charge. Dawn said she rejected the deal offer and was determined to prove her innocence. She remained in jail. The trial began in January 2015, and from the start, it was a farce. Despite the very public statement about having solid evidence of Dawn's involvement in a plot to commit murder, the prosecution's case rested on those 2 text messages, the one to Eddie and the one to the ex-football player. They were easy to interpret as tasteless jokes, just Dawn blowing off steam. Given the likelihood that Eddie had masterminded the harassment himself, the prosecution couldn't possibly put him on the stand. But there was one witness who wanted to see Dawn pay, a genuine victim who got lost in all of this drama. Gabriel Suarez. Outside the courtroom, awaiting his turn as a witness, he said he did believe Dawn intended to do him harm. "If you think someone is harassing you," he said, "you go to the police. You don't try and have them killed." He didn't know all the details of the case, and he didn't really care. All he knew is that she'd said awful things about him and had dragged his name through the mud repeatedly over several months. The whole thing had left him deeply rattled, and he was frustrated that she hadn't made any attempt to apologize for falsely accusing him for heinous crimes. Dawn managed to get a good lawyer who agreed to take her case pro bono. And in swift order, the lawyer destroyed the prosecution and exposed the investigation as a total cluster, a sham. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes before returning its verdict. Not guilty. Dawn spent nearly a year in jail, and during that time, her life fell apart. The business she worked so hard to build was now closed. Her reputation was in tatters, and she was broke and had to move back in with her ex-husband. When she was released from jail, she discovered her health was also in jeopardy. She was diagnosed with colon cancer, a condition that went undiagnosed and untreated while she was incarcerated. After her release, Dawn filed a lawsuit against LA County for medical negligence, but the damage was done. Both Nick and Eddie were arrested and charged with a few pretty serious things, including 3 counts of felony stalking. In 2016, they pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, a misdemeanor, and their punishment was reportedly community service and probation, and an agreement that they wouldn't have contact with Dawn or her family or each other for a minimum of 10 years. Which strangely might be harder than you think. When Dawn was released from jail, she said she was still being stalked and harassed by Eddie. If that detective was right, and that need to stalk and harass was pathological, who's to say Eddie was capable of stopping? Now, this story in Los Angeles Magazine ran almost 10 years ago. And over the years, I wondered about Dawn. I even worried about her. And then I received an email from her in the spring of 2022. And it appeared she was ready for her 3rd, or was it 4th, maybe 5th act. Dawn had an agent, and someone was making a documentary about her. Only the narrative this time wasn't the scandalous, racist facialist. It was a woman who'd been chewed up and spat out by the legal system. It was strange. After all those years of trying to make it in Hollywood, Dawn had become a different type of celebrity, a true crime icon, and an unlikely advocate for criminal justice reform. But I wanted to end on the real star, in real life. Smooth Cheeks Gabriel Suarez. His business appears to be thriving in West Hollywood, and it's fair to say that out of everyone involved in this dirty mess, he's the only one who can honestly say that he came out of this clean and clear. Thank you once again for listening to Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I'll be back in a few days with a whole new true crime story. And this time, we're heading to Paris for a sprawling tale of sweet revenge. Follow the show so you don't miss it. Until then, bonne nuit and nighty-night.